All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are on the final lecture of Unit 2.5, which is all over the French and Indian War and the changes of the colonies as they head towards independence. Looking at the first screenshot that you have right there, we went over the tactics of the Europeans, the guys dressed in red right there. Those are the redcoats from Britain. And you also have the Native Americans who are used to fighting more like we do, kind of set aside and to try to save themselves. They don't want to die, they don't want to stand in straight lines, they don't have the numbers. Whereas again, the Europeans fight a gentleman's war, which we talked about, where you stand in straight lines and shoot at each other. The first part, if you look just at the English and the French, they don't like each other, kind of like sibling rivalry. These two countries have gone thousands of years, hundreds of years actually, fighting each other. And if you see, I give you three examples of really quick of just the wars they've fought in Europe. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. It shouldn't be too difficult to figure out how they are named. If you guessed after the leaders, you are correct. Now this battle, the French and Indian War, takes place here in America between the English and the French, and Indians choosing both sides. They are fighting for the Ohio Valley. And the reason they are fighting for where we live in Ohio and up and down the Ohio River Valley is that both the English and French are now kind of claiming the fur trapping business for them, which of course you're making money with. So the battle is basically, or the war itself is actually fought over the land along the frontier and trying to get the British to move out west, or to move west from the colonies they have now and move into Ohio and past into Kentucky, Tennessee, and further. Now, when they do go to war, when they're preparing to fight the war here in America, the same war is happening back in Europe. It's called the 7 Years' War, which of course is fought for 7 years. Preparing for war, the French, their advantages here in America is that they control more land. The French have all the way from Quebec up in Canada, all the way down to Louisiana, to New Orleans. So they do have a larger chunk of land here in America, whereas the English have the 13 colonies and are hoping to move west. New France itself, the area in America, has one government. So it's easier for them, for the king to send a message and everybody in New France knows what they're doing. Whereas in the colonies, they have 13 different governments and they all have to wait to hear from the king, which then messages have to get sent around. And it's just kind of over and over, people telling people what to do, and it just gets confusing. The French are also sending professional soldiers and sailors in the Navy to fight for this war. The French king sees this as a very important area in his empire to keep for the fur trapping business, for the way to make money. And last but not least, the French have more help in the colonies. The French have more Indian help overall. Going back to the last couple chapters, the French befriended the Indians when they got here, and they've had that nice kind of agreement to be friends with each other ever since. And the French, of course, do not want more land. They have the land they do, and they share it with the Indians, and they want to continue that, whereas the English want more and more land, and they're just never happy. Looking over at the English advantages, they have more people here in America. They have 1 million settlers or 1 million colonists, whereas the French have only 5 or 50,000. That gives them, or the ability, or King George, the King of England, is going to want and tell the colonists to fight for them. And most of the colonists don't like the king. And they find him basically kind of letting them fight the war for him, where it's his money, it's his land, he should have to fight it. The English colonies are also easy to defend. If you're one of the colonists, you have the mountains on the foothills, or you have the Appalachian Mountains on one side of your colonies, you have the Atlantic Ocean on the other. Also, the colonists are more willing to fight. This is a fight for the colonies. So if you're a colonist and you want to stay English and keep what you have, you want to fight the French for the king. You want to actually help out. So there will be a huge kind of split between the colonists of whether or not to fight this war for the king, or whether they don't want to fight and just kind of watch what happens. Last but not least, the English have the largest group of Indians willing to help. They're called the Iroquois League. The Iroquois League is a group of 6 Indian tribes that during peacetime are different separate tribes working differently, away from each other. But then anytime you go to war with one of the tribes, all 6 groups fight together. And one of those groups is known as the Mohawk Indians. And of course we get the name Mohawk of the hairstyle from them. They used to wear their hair nice and long, just like a horse mane almost. And they would be very fierce warriors who like to scalp people during battle. So they were feared in battle, especially with the other Indians and other colonists. All right, moving on to the beginnings of the war. The battles are fought with French and British forts being built along the Ohio River, all the way from the Ohio River, southern Ohio, to northern Ohio with Lake Erie, where we live. And the governor of Virginia, whose last name is actually Governor Dinwiddie. We could kind of laugh at his last name. That's just funny. His idea is because Virginia, the colony, wants to expand to the west and move into Ohio. So the governor of Virginia sends a message or a warning to the French to move out of these forts. And the message he sends is with a young man, a 21-year-old Virginia militia general or leader, or lieutenant. His name is George Washington. And we know George Washington from being basically a hero of America. And he starts here just as a 21-year-old militiaman in Virginia. He is from Virginia. And he takes with him 150 men, and his job is to attack a fort. The fort's called Fort Duquesne, which is a fort built at the fork of the Ohio River. And when he does attack that and tries to give this message to the fort saying, please surrender your forts and move out of our area, the French kind of back off and say, you know, we're not going to take you seriously. You're just a young kid. You're kind of a punk, and you need to get out. So the French and English kind of fight each other. In this case, the French and the Virginia colonists fight each other, sort of beginning the French and Indian War. So, you know, George Washington isn't always a hero like we think. In this case, he actually starts to kind of slaughter people, but he is a great general in a way. He's just starting off right now just as a lieutenant in charge of a group of militia soldiers. So this little battle takes place along Ohio's border, and eventually the French have to send reinforcements to hunt down George Washington after Washington attacks this fort. So Washington and his men, once he meets up with another group, they have about 300 total men, and they are running away from the French trying to hunt them down. When the French eventually find them, they have to, or Washington's kind of, it's a need for Washington to build a fort to help protect him and his men, and they build this fort in a little clearing in the woods. It's called Fort Necessity. It takes them 2 to 3 days to build this tiny fort. The French actually surround them in the woods and basically kind of starve them out over a few days. And with running water and rain kind of flooding the fort, Washington is kind of, after a few days of not giving up. Washington's one of those guys who would never try to give up. He wants to fight till the end, you know, with his men dying or whatever. But after his men are running out of food and supplies after days, the French end up taking them. Basically, they ask for surrender, and Washington has no choice but to surrender or die. So Washington and his men are left with honors in that gentleman's war agreement to leave, and then the French build down the fort. Here's a picture of what Fort Necessity would have looked like. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and you can see that it's not really meant to hide. It's more meant to protect the men. All right, the war itself. One of the big major things you have to understand is that the king wanted the colonists to fight for him, and the king calls Ben Franklin, hero of America, over to England for him, and he meets with Ben Franklin and basically tells Ben that we need to work together, you know, the English and the colonists, to help do this. And basically the king said, I can't afford to pay for this war. I can't send my soldiers. I'm already fighting a war here in England, and I need you, the colonists, to help me fight this for your own land as well. So Ben Franklin comes back and calls a meeting in Albany, New York. And the meeting is basically to get all 13 colonies to meet together and agree to unite to fight together. And the idea that Ben Franklin brings up is that, like arrows, if all 13 colonies are being held in like an eagle's hand, that's his actual quote, is that if the 13 colonies work together like arrows in your hand, you can't break all 13 colonies. You can't break all 13 arrows if you hold them all together. Whereas if the colonies agree to fight one at a time in this French and Indian War, you could easily break one arrow at a time in your hand, but if all of them work together, they'd be unstoppable. Now when they vote, the vote goes pretty negatively towards the king, and the colonies agree that this isn't their war and they don't want to pay taxes to build an army. So the colonies kind of shoot down the king's idea and say that it's up to the king to fight the war. So this is something that definitely the king is going to hold against them afterwards. So now the king has to pay for this war to happen. One of the major battles, or one of the major things that takes place in the war, is something called Braddock's defeat. And you have a general named General Braddock from back in England, who's marching 2,000 soldiers and militiamen from the colonies, including George Washington, to recapture that same fort, Fort Duquesne. Now Braddock has 40 years of military experience. He grew up understanding a gentleman's war. He understands that men are going to fight in single, straight lines and shoot all at the same time. His soldiers are dressed in beautiful red uniforms called redcoats. and he's dragging his cannons, having drummers and trumpeters play, and everything else you could think of. It's meant to look royal and fantastic. It's meant to look amazing. And basically, George Washington is warning him that, hey, look, this isn't how the French and Indians are fighting out here, especially the Indians. The Indians are going to try to ambush us in the woods. And of course, General Braddock says, basically, George Washington, you're just a tiny baby, and I'm not listening to you. You're just a 21-year-old punk kid. I'm the one who has the experience. You need to listen to me because I'm the smartest man alive. And basically, when they go into this ambush, the Indians are coming out of the woods at every direction. The British aren't ready for this. Their gentleman's war techniques do not work against the kind of guerrilla warfare of the Indians. And when you look at the stats down here, 900 men are killed or wounded, including General Braddock, who has 4 or 5 horses, I believe, shot from underneath him, and then he jumps on new ones. Washington and his men actually get out. I believe somewhere that I read that Washington actually had a couple bullet holes in his coat, but he was missed. He actually did not get shot in the body. Now, Braddock is buried somewhere in Pennsylvania near where this all took place, or somewhere near the forks of the Ohio River. He's buried in an area basically on the side of the road with no big, huge, awesome, cemetery, or he doesn't have any fancy gravestones, and that's so that the Indians couldn't find him, dig him up, and basically mutilate his body. There's a picture of Braddock's defeat. You see the British on the road kind of marching, whereas the Indians are guerrilla warfare tactics, hiding behind trees, shooting their guns, and then they're going to be running at the men in red with their tomahawks and knives drawn. The war is coming to an end. You have the man back in England. His name's William Pitt. He is the Minister of War for England. No relation to Brad. He immediately sends more redcoats and warships to America, understanding that this area of the empire, this American colonies, are very important to make money. Now, William Pitt's plan is to capture the 3 major forts, Louisburg, Duquesne, and Ticonderoga in New York. And you have his men, Jeffrey Amherst, capturing Louisburg. You have them capturing Fort Duquesne, burning it down, and then creating a new fort called Fort Pitt. Now, all those people that hate Pittsburgh, we shouldn't like this moment of history, because Fort Pitt is where it now, or at least today, where Pittsburgh stands. Pittsburgh is named after Fort Pitt and the Minister of War for England. The French blow up their own fort, which is Fort Ticonderoga. They don't even surrender it. They just actually set it on fire and leave it. And in this case, if you notice, with those 3 victories, the British begin winning the French and Indian War. Moving on to the last major battle, the Battle of Quebec, which is the capital of New France. It involves over 10,000 soldiers. Here's a painting of what it looked like. It takes place in Canada. Hopefully that's not shocking. And the commander for the British is James Wolfe, who dies, I believe, during the war, and he brings up 4,000 men to kind of march up this embankment or hill to attack the city. The leader for Quebec for the French is Marquis de Montcalm, who you'll see in a movie soon, and both of those men die while they're fighting, but the English capture the capital of New France, and basically once you capture that, it's the capital of the other side, just like capture the flag. Once you've done that, you're pretty much gonna win the war. All right, when the treaty is drawn up to end the war, it's called the Treaty of Paris because it is drawn up in or written in Paris. And it takes 2 years to write, and that's because it's a compromise where both sides, or all the sides, have to agree. And if one side is being a big baby about it, then these sides can't agree to this compromise. So Great Britain, when it's all said and done, receives all of New France, Florida, all the land east of the Mississippi River. So if you notice, the British had before the area of dark kind of gold up here in Hudson Bay, and then over here with the 13 colonies. Well, with the victory in this war, they received the lighter yellow part, and they double the size of the colonies. So this is all brand new land that the colonists and the king have. The colonies are hoping that they can expand past this border right here into the newer New World in a way. The French lose pretty much everything except for 2 little fishing right islands out here. So the French get to kind of just basically fish, and that's about it. And the Spanish, who are involved with that as well, the Spanish are actually helping the English, and the French give Louisiana, which is down here, the French give this area of Louisiana to the Spanish so that they can control it as well. So the French basically go from having more land than anyone to nothing, and the British double their size. So the British, again, continue becoming this awesome powerhouse of a country. So hopefully you enjoyed everything today and took some notes over the weekend, and be ready for your quiz this coming week.